Welcome back to the Druber Health Podcast, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again. Some exciting news. I did reach enough individual listeners recently where I can now start accepting listener support. So if you want to donate to the podcast, you have the option to do so. You can do, I think, one time or reoccurring if you want. I'm not doing this for any monetary reasons, but I do appreciate the support. I'm just more than happy to get this information out there and make it accessible. So today's episode, I figured I would talk about my Monday meal again. We'll go through it probably a lot quicker than we did last week, and then we're going to talk about glyphosate, which is a herbicide, pesticide, chemical. So Monday meals for this week. I woke up and I didn't have a whole lot of time before I needed to run some errands and whatnot, get some stuff done for the business. So I literally woke up, went upstairs, and I had some sausage and whole milk grass-fed cheese that I found at Woodman's. So the sausage is from Waseda Farms Market, so it's like a beef sausage, no sugar added, no nitrates, so that's good. So I had some piece of that just to kind of like tide me over, because if I don't eat anything in the morning, I don't function super well. So I got most of those things done right away in the morning, and then I had some time for lunch. And for lunch, I had an omelet with the grass-fed beef heart, the ground beef heart, had that mixed in there. I had venison bacon along with that, which is really tasty. And then I also have, I think it's Apple Valley. I can't remember the name of the brand, but they do like organic, grass-fed, no nitrates, grass-fed beef hot dogs. So I just threw a little hot dog on my griddle, threw the bacon on the griddle. Like I said, it's venison bacon. I believe this honestly might be from a deer that someone in my family shot. It could have been my cousin Matt from a few prior episodes ago. Otherwise, maybe it was my uncle or my other cousin Mitch. Who knows? But guys, whoever it was, thank you for the venison. Appreciate it. So that was lunch. Super tasty. I believe I had milk with lunch as well. So I had like 32 ounces of the raw grass-fed A2 whole milk. It was super tasty. And then for a snack later in the day, I had some mashed potatoes. And I didn't just eat the mashed potatoes straight up. I actually put the mashed potatoes back on the griddle and cooked them. So I fried them essentially, and they tasted just like hash browns, which is awesome. So by mashing and boiling the potatoes first, I was able to remove and lower the levels of phytic acid in the potatoes and potentially destroying other anti-nutrients. So overall, just like cooking and heating is going to be an option. For some anti-nutrients, it can work well. Others, they're a little bit more resilient, so it doesn't do much. So that being said, if you're cooking and boiling and doing all this other stuff, pressure cooking, it's still going to have some positive effects on your food. So I fried the mashed potatoes into that hash brown form, and then I also cut up organic apple. And then for the apples, I don't eat the peel because that's typically where the anti-nutrients are going to be located, along with the other like harmful stuff. If there is going to be any chemical exposure or contamination, typically the peel or the outside is going to have the highest amounts. So I just I have like this like apple slicer cutout thing. So I had a bunch of these pieces, and I just essentially bite basically all the way up to the peel and leave the peel and have all of the tasty stuff. So definitely, if you're eating apples, don't eat the core, because not only is that going to be loaded with anti-nutrients, but it also typically, if there's going to be any sort of like contamination from arsenic or heavy metals, that's where it's going to be. Then I went into coach at Warrior Jungle, and normally I don't coach on Mondays, but our normal coach was on vacation, so I was covering classes. There was a long enough break in between the two of the classes where I was actually able to get a little bit of a workout in. So in preparation for that workout, I put together in a glass bottle basically a mixture of kefir, and the kefir is from Maple Hills, so it's grass-fed, whole milk, great stuff, organic, and then a little bit of half and half from Organic Valley, which is grass-fed. And then I also finished it off. So it's just like a portion of kefir, a portion of half and half, and then most of it is that raw milk that I normally drink. And so I put that mixture in there. I also added in some maple syrup. So I had a little bit more carbohydrates, a little more sugars in there. And that was kind of like my post-workout drink. So I brought that along to Warrior Jungle and just left it in our little mini fridge in the office. And then after I finished my workout, had that. So I was getting in some carbohydrates and some nutrients right after my workout, which was good. Got home from work, and then I cooked up some mule deer meat. So, fun fact, my dad was actually out in Canada hunting mule deer recently, and he got one, so we brought it back, and we processed it. So we cut it up into, I have like diced meat, and we've got steaks, and then we also have some ground mule deer meat as well, which is pretty awesome. So, and he let me keep a bunch of it, so I'll be eating mule deer for a while, which is great. So I cooked that up, and then I melted some grass-fed butter to go along with basically the mule deer meat. I have been a big fan of just kind of doing salt and then butter to go along with like the steaks that I'm having. It's tasty enough for me. And then what I also did is for this meal, I put together a yogurt bowl. So I did Stonyfield, grass-fed, whole milk, Greek yogurt, so the high-protein stuff. And then I found a different yogurt. It's from Maple Hills, so the same brand as the kefir, and it's grass-fed, organic, and it's just really clean stuff. So I added a few scoops of that into the yogurt bowl, and then we added some maple syrup, organic stuff, and then my normal dose of magnesium citrate, my normal dose of the collagen protein powder, that's grass-fed, and then I added in some organic blueberries. So that was my last meal of the day. And then at some point later that evening, I did also take my supplements. I took my beef organ supplements and my vitamin D. And that was basically my food and nutritional intake on Monday. Now it's time to talk about glyphosate. So glyphosate is a pesticide, herbicide. Basically, it kills cells. So glyphosate is almost single-handedly ruining our food industry for a multitude of reasons. So glyphosate has been a publicly registered pesticide since 1974, but it's mostly used as a herbicide. So it is the active ingredient in Roundup, which many people use to keep their lawns looking nice. And so not only does it harm plants, but animals as well. Monsanto, the company, became a multi-billion-dollar corporation off of the sale and distribution of glyphosate. So in humans, it's known as an endocrine and gut disruptor and is heavily linked to causing cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or lymphatic leukemia. As of 2022, Monsanto had handed over $11 billion in lawsuit payouts, with tens of thousands more pending so tens of thousands more lawsuits pending. And within the past couple of years, Monsanto was actually bought out by Bayer, which is a pharmaceutical company, a really big one. So there's definitely greed and corruption to be thinking about. In regard to those companies. I mean, I don't think it's unknown to people that pharmaceutical companies are not the most trustworthy companies. We are the only country that allows pharmaceuticals to be advertised on television, and they're everywhere, and it's unfortunate. So I don't really see anything changing anytime soon with glyphosate use or glyphosate regulations. So we'll have to see what happens. That's why we got to make sure that we're doing our own due diligence and doing our best to stay away from foods that may be contaminated with them. So back to Roundup and the crop. So basically, a lot of crops now are genetically modified. So anything that was be labeled as like a GMO, genetically modified so that they are Roundup ready, meaning that they are resistant to glyphosate. So what that means is when they are sprayed, the weeds around them will die, but the genetically modified crops will survive. So the soil and these plants are getting doused with glyphosate and chemicals, surviving. However, they're going to continue to carry these chemicals throughout the process. They're contaminated from here on out. So that's why it's super important to get organic food that has not been treated with chemicals. So glyphosate started being used more commonly, I believe, in the late 1980s, for sure 1990s. It was being used in corn. And then early 2000s, actually I should say like mid 2000s, so it was like 2006 when they started spraying, like widespread, spraying wheat crops to essentially harvest them early. Otherwise, they had to wait longer. And by harvesting them earlier, they could avoid some of the mold contamination of the wheat. However, the mold problem might have been solved, but the wheat that we were eating, so all the wheat that was going into any of the processed food, any of the bread we were having, the flour, that was all containing glyphosate. So there's like a little correlation to my life and my family's life that I was looking back and kind of putting two and two together. I can't directly say that it's a causation, but it's definitely an uncanny correlation. So growing up, my brother, Dalton's favorite food was bread and butter. And at the time we were using not butter, I can't believe it's not butter, so a margarine with, I'm sure it was horrible oils inside. I haven't looked at the ingredient list on that recently, but not great. But basically it was wheat bread loaded with butter. So that was his probably most favorite snack food. I loved having with meals. That was like his go-to. And he was eating it all the time. That was right around 2006, like I mentioned. That's when they really started spraying the wheat crop with glyphosate. And in early 2007 was when my brother Dalton was diagnosed with leukemia. So there's that correlation there. It's really just one of those unfortunate things. And, after Dalton's battle with cancer, he became gluten intolerant, which is a really common thing now for people. And that association is with the chemical use on wheat crops. Glyphosate is cytotoxic, like I mentioned before. So it destroys our gut along with other things and, makes us less efficient when digesting a lot of these things that our bodies were able to normally digest or at least overcome. Yeah, and it was really interesting to see that correlation kind of pop up when I learned about the timeline of the introduction of like glyphosate into our crop industry and when cancer popped up in our family. Another thing too is if you look back at gluten intolerance and celiac disease, those weren't really very common diseases prior to 2000. And, after that, along with the introduction of these chemicals being sprayed on our crops, that's when celiac disease and gluten intolerance really skyrocketed. So there's definitely a correlation there between chemical and glyphosate use and our ability to digest grains and foods that we would normally be able to. A lot of us are now unable to keep up with that. So glyphosate in food is definitely something that we should be mindful of. But what a lot of people forget is that crops go into other areas of our lives. They go into cosmetics, skincare, lotions. They also go into the clothes that we're wearing. So if you really want to be mindful it's in a lot of different places. I would say if you're going to focus in one area, focus in your food. And then if you're looking to try to remove chemical and glyphosate contamination from other areas, you can definitely go to your food your clothes and whatever else you're putting on your skin. A lot of people forget that our skin is also a digestive system. So my rule of thumb is I really don't like putting anything on my skin that I wouldn't also ingest. So if I'm not going to eat it, I don't think I really want to put it on my skin because my skin is doing the exact same thing that my, digestive system internally is doing. So pay attention to your cosmetics if you want, and you can definitely look into sunscreens as well, and making sure that you're having clean options as far as those go. So for me, in order to avoid contamination in those areas, I have started using a tallow-based moisturizer. Actually, it was a tallow-based moisturizer. Now I actually just straight up use tallow as a moisturizer. It works great. I haven't had any issues. Skin's been super healthy. I also have a tallow-based bar soap that I use. So I think there's like tallow, honey, and then there's like a crucial ingredient to like make solid soap, and I think that's in there. But it's pretty basic. Another thing too that I've tried focusing on is, so I know cotton is a lot of times treated with chemicals and glyphosate, but I still think cotton is a better alternative to polyester and any of those man-made plastic type fabrics. So I've been trying to stay away from polyester, moving to a lot of like cotton clothing, and some of my cotton clothing is also organic as well. Now, organic cotton clothing gets expensive, so I don't have an entire wardrobe of that. You can also buy, animal fur, so like wool is an option. I think bamboo is pretty decent too. You can get some bamboo material that's organic as well. So there's definitely some options out there. So there was a study out there that had participants, at least had a portion of the participants, and these were male subjects, but they wore cotton underwear, and another portion wore polyester underwear. And I can't remember how long they wore that for. I want to say it was roughly a month. Can't remember off the top of my head. However, they looked into fertility status after consistently wearing either the cotton underwear and the polyester underwear, and fertility levels and ability in the men with cotton were much higher than the men with polyester. Now, I don't know what other lifestyle habits these subjects had, but based on the parameters of the study between the use of cotton versus polyester, it seems like a no-brainer to start shifting over to cotton and organic materials on our skin if we can. Due to widespread glyphosate use, we have a massive amount of contamination in our soil, groundwater, drinking water, crops for humans, and animal feed. It's even possible for the air to become tainted with the glyphosate. There's actually plenty of air-based contamination throughout the U.S. as far as glyphosate goes. So it's all over the place, and really that goes through for the entire world, but especially in the U.S., which is why we need to do our best to avoid it when we can and support organic practices. So glyphosate is especially well-versed in chelating, essentially binding to minerals and other micronutrients from plants and soil and rendering those minerals unusable. In fact, before it was used as a pesticide, it was patented as a metal binding agent. So by seeing how harmful this is to living organisms, it just shows how important minerals are to the overall health of living things. Now, due to the fact that glyphosate binds and chelates to these minerals, it's being sprayed on our soil, in our water, in our crops. Basically, our soil is becoming less mineral dense because of that. It's not able to pass on those minerals to the crops that are growing there. And not only that, but the crops are also being subjected to the glyphosate, so minerals are coming out of those. In our water, if glyphosate is there, it's binding to the minerals. Same thing goes for the water soil. People don't really think about that, but there's plenty of plant life in our waterways and ocean systems and whatnot, and that's getting affected as well. So there is a lot of damage that can be done due to glyphosate. So if our crops, at least our industrial produced crops, non-organic crops, are having less minerals to work with due to glyphosate, and the fact that glyphosate is being sprayed on them, then we also have to take into account the fact that they also contain a lot of these plant foods will also contain phytic acid. So that is stealing what's left of the minerals in those foods, and it's really making the bioavailability of minerals in plant-based foods that are non-organic almost non-existent, which is very unfortunate. So normal food that people are getting from the grocery store is so far depleted in vital nutrients. So the takeaway here is that due to glyphosate and its sustained use in our crop industry, our current food stock is substantially less nutrient dense than it was 100, even 50 years ago. So next up, I'm going to break down why glyphosate is a cytotoxin without going like super in depth. So we'll keep it relatively surface level here. So in order to understand glyphosate's effects, we must first understand our body composition. So our bodies are built up through basically amino acids. Amino acids are like the building blocks of our body and our cells. One specific amino acid called glycine is critical to anti-inflammation and protection of our cells and immune response in our body. Unfortunately, glyphosate is a similar enough compound to glycine that it binds to glycine receptors when it's in our bodies. So it takes the place of glycine, and because glyphosate is taking the place of glycine, it's not the same. It's a horrible replacement, which means this normal stuff that should be happening throughout your body is no longer happening, or it's not happening as efficient because glyphosate has taken up those receptor spots. And that gives you really some insight into why people are developing gluten intolerance, celiac disease, and other like autoimmune diseases. A lot of that is due to long-term consistent exposure to glyphosate contamination. And it also shows just how damaging it can be from a cancer standpoint when our cells are being damaged at that level. So we're seeing increase in cancers in certain areas, specifically like leukemias and whatnot. Young kids are now getting leukemia. In the past, leukemia was an old person's disease, and we're seeing a lot of that in young patients. So, ages 1 to 10, essentially. And then it dives down a little bit, but we're still seeing it throughout the entire population. So those lawsuits against Monsanto, those are cancer-related lawsuits. And a lot of that is from using like household Roundup on lawns in yards. And a lot of that is, industry exposure as well. So it's everywhere. And unfortunately, it became a household item due to Monsanto. So thank you, Monsanto. So after my freshman year in college, I came back home and I worked for my neighbor who owns a lawn care company. And they do there's a section of the company that's basically just like cutting, weed whacking, doing like the grooming of the grass. And there was a portion of the company that was doing fertilizer and pest control and weed control and that sort of thing. So I worked on the weed control, fertilizer, pest control side of things. So I was hauling around and mixing chemicals, putting down fertilizer and that sort of thing. And I had to take a course to make sure I knew all like the safety stuff, and I had to pass a test. It's really serious stuff. Like you want to make sure that you are wearing industrial safety gear. So that was, gloves and boots, and just making sure you were covered up. So there was definitely like seriousness around that. I don't think at that point I really understood really how serious contamination could be. And honestly, like looking back, feel like I'm pretty fortunate that I only worked there one summer. It's hard to imagine, for me, not realizing how big of an issue was. Maybe I wouldn't be taking the safety things super seriously. And if I had been doing that for years and years and years, it's definitely could have been some contamination towards me there, and who knows what would have happened to me. So here's some more glyphosate facts for you. So the U.S. currently is saying that anything under 7 parts per billion in our drinking water is safe. So that's that level, 7 parts per billion. We move over to Europe, and their regulations there are saying that anything over 0.1 parts per billion is unsafe. That is a huge divide and a huge difference between what's considered safe in the U.S. and what's considered safe in Europe. And we need to be mindful of that because we are drinking water to be healthy, right? And that's a consistent drink in most of our lives. And if that's being contaminated with glyphosate and we're having this long-term consistent exposure to it, you can only imagine what's happening to our bodies on a cellular level. So now we're going to talk about a different aspect of water contamination. So basically back in 2014 when I was in college, I took an environmental sustainability class and learned about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's basically stemming from the mouth of the Mississippi River, and then it basically covers roughly 4,280 square miles of the Gulf of Mexico. The cause of this dead zone, which is also known as a hypoxic zone due to abysmal oxygen levels, is linked to fertilizer contamination, basically, so nitrogen and phosphorus specifically, and chemical use like glyphosate. We know that glyphosate causes cell disruption and death in living cells, especially in higher concentrations. We also know that glyphosate chelates and binds to minerals, essentially stealing them from the environment, right? So when taking those into account, if you look at a current map depiction of glyphosate use in the U.S., you will see a high concentration of use in the Midwest, and then following the Mississippi River down. What that means is that there's a direct use contamination in these areas that glyphosate is being used, but also major accumulating contamination from runoff into the Mississippi River. So these, areas are adjacent to the Mississippi River. All that runoff is leading that direction and then heading south through the U.S. So the further down you go on the Mississippi, the higher concentration of contamination it is. So, being up in the Midwest, actually here in Wisconsin, border of Minnesota, you're going to experience lower, and there's still contamination, but lower contamination levels up here compared to down in Louisiana, Mississippi. So this runoff has effectively destroyed a large portion of the Gulf of Mexico. It's destroying the plant and animal ecosystem. What hasn't been talked about and what we didn't cover in that class was the contamination's effect on humans. It's really unfortunate because right now Louisiana is a major cancer hotspot in the U.S., along with other metabolic issues. Ultimately, glyphosate is horrible, and these multi-billion-dollar companies like Monsanto and Bayer, they don't plan on stopping production or use of these anytime soon. So that means it's really up to us as the consumers to change where the demand is, and we need to be moving away from industrial, non-organic foods, and hopefully, by focusing on organic stuff, we can shift the movement and shift the demand towards healthier and safer food. So I did have a couple listener questions after the last episode. One of them was asking, okay, you've been talking about organ meat and whatnot a lot. Why is it better? Organ meat is going to be way more nutrient dense than even just like your typical red meat. So it's going to be loaded with more minerals, like much higher concentration of crucial minerals. It's also going to have more and higher levels of crucial amino acids. And we know how important amino acids are to our body's overall functioning. Those are basically the building blocks of our body. Now, something that people don't really think about is creatine is really prominent in red meat. Now, that's especially the same in organ meat. Normally, when people think of creatine, they're thinking of just taking it in supplement form, and a lot of people take it, and it's one of the most studied supplements out there. But you can get it naturally from the food you're getting. So a person with a high meat diet is going to naturally be getting creatine, which creatine is just overall a very important building block. It's important for brain health, cell health, muscle health, and the fact that, people have to supplement just means we're not getting it from our normal food sources anymore. Now, I know this is more about organ meat and whatnot, but I did want to touch a little bit more on creatine. Creatine is something that our brains actually very highly utilize and crave. And so my brother Dalton, he's been through a lot, but he's also been through a lot of concussions. And I shouldn't be laughing because they're very serious. It's been a repetitive thing. So he's been dealing with a lot of side effects from all of these concussions. And one thing I recommended to him was that he start taking creatine. He's also very active, and he's a very, very talented and strong rock climber. So not only is the creatine helping him physically, but it's also helping recovery in his brain as well. So he's been taking that, and that's something that anybody who is suffered from a traumatic brain injury, to make sure that they're getting enough creatine in is going to be super helpful. So another question that a listener brought up is they noticed that I had been mentioning nitrates a lot when talking about the food that I'm eating. So nitrates are a naturally occurring compound, right? They're found in plant-based foods. However, they're also used as a preservative. So there's basically different forms of nitrates. I believe there's like sodium nitrates and potassium nitrates are pretty common. And a lot of that is used in like processed meats. So we're talking like, potentially jerky, sausage, hot dogs, bacon, any sort of like processed meat is probably going to have nitrates. And the issue is that we are getting much higher levels of nitrates from these foods now. And those, when they're ingested in our bodies, they can get converted into nitrosamines. And that is a carcinogenic substance and is linked to cancer. So nitrates are definitely something you're going to want to be mindful of when you are doing your grocery shopping. I'm always looking for packaging that is saying no nitrates or no added nitrates in these foods. And been pretty successful. I found hot dogs without nitrates. I found bacon without nitrates. So it's out there. You just got to keep your eyes open for it. And the last thing I really wanted to add on to this episode, referring to our episode from last week in oxalates, is I mentioned some foods that were containing oxalates, and I wanted to give you guys a better picture of the levels of oxalates in these foods. So I actually created a pretty extensive list. I have a PDF of that, so if you are interested in getting that full list, let me know. I'll send it over to you. Basically, it has them ranked from highest amount of oxalates to lowest amount of oxalates in a lot of these common foods. Now, as far as what you guys can expect next week, we'll probably talk about deuterium, and I think I'm going to also combine lectins in there as well, so it'll be a double dose. Might be a longer episode because there's a lot to talk about for deuterium. And I'm combining those because I really want to start talking about other foods. The first food area I'm going to talk about most likely is probably dairy. That's one that's super important to me, and I have a lot to talk about regarding that, so really looking forward to that. We'll probably be putting that episode out within the next week or two, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. And just a reminder too, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I now have listener support activated. I have no idea how that works, so if you guys figure that out while listening, great. Maybe we'll figure out at some point in time, but it is an option. So if you want to support the podcast, you absolutely can. But like I said, I am more than happy just doing this for free. I want to get this information out there to you guys so we can all just be healthier. And one more thing before we go here, I really wanted to just highly recommend that you guys listen to a podcast episode by Dr. Paul Saladino featuring Dr. Zach Bush. Dr. Zach Bush takes a huge dive into glyphosate, and there's a lot more information that I just didn't even get to cover today. So if you're looking for a deeper dive on glyphosate, if this really interested you today, I highly recommend taking a listen to that because he covers a lot of stuff, and a lot of it might just blow your mind too. It's very interesting. That being said, keep those questions coming, keep those updates coming. I really enjoy hearing those from you, and just wanted to thank you all for tuning in on a weekly basis. I really appreciate the support and being able to work with everyone. So stay tuned and stay healthy.